Hello and welcome to the Trusted Podcast.
Guys, have we got a guest for you today? From one of the earliest sales professionals at AJ Bell to a lifelong career at Octopus and now as a director at Praetura, today we've got Jon Prescott.
From boots on the ground to building a market-leading distribution team, he really has done it all.
Sit back, grab a cuppa and get ready for the content. Jon Prescott, welcome to the Trusted Podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to see you
Good
both.
to have you here, Jon.
Pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
So we're going to kick things off. By getting to know you a little bit better. We're always really interested in what makes our guests tick. So
How long have you got?
here we go. So let's go right back to the start.
Yeah.
So what about your upbringing do you think influenced your career, and what impact did that have on you as you transitioned into financial services?
Do you want the deep dark stuff as well? Or?
All the nitty gritty.
Everything.
No, so there isn't any, to be fair. So my background, working class family. My dad was a coach driver. My mum was, as you would say at the time, a housewife. So very working class. Financially not a lot of cash around to do all those lovely things. You know, we did go on holidays, but there were UK holidays and what have you. So I think my background, it was a great background, but things were pretty tough. But despite all of that, I would argue I was brought up really well, with all, good moral compass and all those other things. But I think more importantly, just from a point of view of where I've kind of finished, wherever that is, or however you describe that, is there was always a very, very strong work ethic. So I played a huge amount of sport when I was younger, and very, very competitive. And I think that's probably, it's that competitiveness and that you've got to work hard for everything. Nothing comes on a plate. My daughter's 21 now, and she's probably relatively fortunate, but instilled in her from day one is nothing's for free. You got to work hard, So I'd say, good upbringing, loving family, all the rest of it. Wasn't a lot of cash around and all that kind of stuff, but a very good upbringing from a moral compass point of view. Do the right thing, work hard, and the rest will take care of itself.
Do you think then, obviously, kind of the absence of cash, did that have a influence on what type of career that you chose?
Do you know what? Really good question. I don't think it did. So, so there was a lack of cash. There's no doubt about that. Without going into too many sob stories, I didn't go on old school trips, that type of thing, which was a bit embarrassing at the time. But it's life. You get on with it. Education was always really important. And to be honest, though, I think back. I was actually thinking about this on the way over here. I haven't seen a few of the questions, and I don't ever remember my mum and dad sitting me down and saying, right, where are you up to with, this homework or that? I never remember that ever happening. So I think I was quite self-motivated, to be honest. I was very inquisitive as a child. I was self-motivated. But, going back directly to your question, do I think it... No, I don't think it did. I think just to go back a little bit further, I actually wanted to be a barrister. So in my early teens, I had ambitions of being a barrister.
Lay down the
That's
law.
got nothing to do with having the wig, just to be clear. But I did have ambitions of being a barrister, and that kind of carried on all the way through to do my A-levels. I read A-level law and so forth. And it quickly became apparent it wasn't the thing for me to do, etc. But yeah, so, and again, I wasn't thinking money there. I've never been, don't get me wrong, we want all the niceties, you want to go on holidays and have a nice house and all that type of stuff, but I've never been completely motivated by money, because I think if you do, you make some really bad decisions. You'll end up in a place you don't want to be, that could be a dark place. So I've never been completely motivated by that. However, being quite frank and being honest, I think when I was younger, I'd look around and, some friends, it was very clear they had a lot more. And yeah, I'd be lying if I didn't say, oh, I'd like to have that, or I'd like to have a house like that, or whatever. So I suppose some of, there'd be some of my appetite came from wanting things we couldn't have, but it definitely isn't the sole driver, and still isn't the sole driver today. Absolutely not. Yeah.
And then the question is, Jon, how did you end up at AJ Bell? And for, the viewers, you joined AJ Bell in 1998.
98, yeah.
So in the early days, certainly not the behemoth that we know of it today.
Yeah.
What led you there?
Yeah, so good question. So I read economics, like you did.
Only the best.
Yeah, absolutely. So I read economics, and to be honest, didn't really know what I wanted to do. I think a lot of people, particularly in sales, fall into financial services sales by accident. I think you do. But I ended up leaving university on the Friday, and on the Monday, I started work at a firm of financial advisors in the Northwest, and they had a SaaS book, small self-administered schemes, and I started there, and it was a 6-month contract. But that was a way of me getting into work, etc. And it started great. The individual I worked for, and I know this is partly about leadership, etc. He was a really poor example of how to be a leader. It wasn't a good experience, I've got to be honest. But anyway, I worked there, and I just so happened to come across a guy called Nicholas Littlefair, who was a co-founder of AJ Bell with Andy, because AJ Bell in the very early days, they designed, produced some software to help other SaaS administrators administer their SaaS book. So this particular firm I was working at, they had this software. So Nicholas had come over to train everybody on it, and I did the training, and I got on with him really well, and he's a really nice guy and all the rest of it. Anyway, this 6 months ended, and I went to a recruiter. I had nothing lined up, pretty scary. I just bought a house with my then girlfriend, who's now my wife for 26 years. And this recruiter said, "Oh, there's an opportunity in Manchester." And this is the truth, So every now and then you land lucky, and this was my bit of luck in life. So great. My dad said, "Right, I'll give you a lift." So I get my dad's car because I didn't drive at the time, and he drove me to Manchester.
Was that the dock office at the time?
Correct. The old dock office, correct. So anyway, I didn't know what to expect, and I kept seeing this name, you're being interviewed by Nicholas, and I couldn't for the life of me. It probably demonstrates how stupid I am, but I couldn't for the life of me remember where I'd met this guy and why I knew his name. Anyway, I go into his room, and there he sat there, and then it kind of all clicked. And I got on with him really well, and Nicholas is a lovely guy. So we got chatting. Anyway, long story short, he offered me the job there and then, which was fantastic. So I think that was a 60% pay rise on previous role. So right now I am on cloud 9. The life doesn't get any better. I hadn't worked out to travel from Leyland to Manchester. Not worked out that I'd been the cost of doing that. But it was fantastic. So I got offered there and then. So I went in as an administrator. That was back in 98, working with some really great people in this. I don't think they mind me saying this, pretty grotty office, the old dock office, people were crammed in. But you know what? And again, without kind of coming straight off cue, there are still people there today at AJ Bell that were there when I started.
How many people would have been in that dock office? Just to, again, give some context.
I think when I started, there were 18 of us.
Amazing.
18 of us. And I must admit, the hair's going up on the back of my neck talking about it now. It was fantastic. It was great fun as well. Really good fun. Andy was... How old would Andy have been then? I don't know. What's Andy now?
40 something maybe?
No,
even younger.
Much younger, yeah.
Really?
So I'm 51. I think Andy was born in 66 or something like that. Something like that. In fact, I think he was born on tax year ends, 66 or something like that. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, he made it fun. We go out for beers, we played football together. It was just a really nice atmosphere, and you wouldn't have talked about it then. The culture, everybody's talking about culture now, and everybody's writing it down. You didn't do that then. You certainly didn't write it down anyway. But the culture was fantastic. It was
organic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes from the top. Let's be honest, it comes from the top. So it was fantastic, and they're still great memories.
And through that kind of period, obviously you then left AJ Bell in 2014. So 16 years through meteoric rise. That period between the late 90s and kind of the mid.
Very little down to me, just to be clear. But I was there. Yeah.
Sometimes you are hanging on to the coattails, and that business is going through the rise. Yeah. How do you stay afloat? How do you stay relevant? How do you keep your head above water as an individual whilst that business is going through that meteoric rise?
Yeah, so I would say, so it's a good question. So I say a few things. Everybody knew what their part was in the overall business. We all had a role. We all had to fulfill our role. And I think what you got from AJ Bell, and again, this does come from the top, Andy Nicholas, and even, some other people there, Robin Larby, who's long retired, Mike Shelmadine, who's long retired. He retired even when I was working at AJ Bell. All these people made it very, very clear what was required of you, what your part in all of that was. So I worked in the administration side, and I think Andy Bell's words, not mine. I think he referred to me once as the worst administrator he's ever had, which I thought
We've all been there, John, don't we?
Lewis's nickname at AJ Bell was Shoddy Roddy. So
Did it really? Is that right?
That didn't come from Andy.
Yeah, no, okay, well, yeah. So,
not quite a privilege.
Not quite as impressive, but yeah. So listen, I'm not an administrator. I'm not, and I think, if I've been reasonably good at sales, not many half decent salespeople are good administrators, but yeah. So I was fortunate enough though to, through that kind of growth in the business, work in various areas of the business, and fairly quickly ended up in sales, and worked with some amazing people you wouldn't even recognise. There wouldn't be names you'd recognise, but they were great people. But you remain relevant by, going with the flow, but working hard, and I've always said, if you can work hard, skills wise, I'd rather take somebody who can work really, really hard with, a few skills, and somebody who's got all the skills in the world but doesn't have the same work ethic, because you can do something with that. You can learn a lot of this stuff, but you can't learn appetite and all the rest of it. So just worked hard, and it was hard at times, but there was, like I say, there was this culture, everybody's working together, all pointing in the same direction. And yes, it was hard and tough and all the rest of it, but you knew why you were there. You knew what we were trying to create, even without even talking about it. And listen, not everybody kind of had 16 years there, but like I say, there's still people there today. So I think you just got on with it. You didn't overcomplicate it. I could sit here and come up with some kind of, I did that, I did this. I didn't, maybe I got a bit lucky for, staying there 16 years, but you just cracked on. Yeah.
And 16 years is, increasingly uncommon in one business, for a lot of people nowadays. Yeah. What are the benefits and drawbacks of staying in one place, considered rather than moving?
Yeah. So I would say the benefits are, if you work hard, you have an opportunity to obviously grow with the business and, get your promotions, etc., and build a lot of respect. So that, that's definitely an advantage. You can build some, very, very good long-term friends as well. People I'm still in touch with, the drawbacks are, and again, I said very early during this, I'm not completely motivated by money, but I think there's almost an expectation now. You move every 3 years, which I'm not an advocate of. I've got to be honest. I'm not an advocate of it. I think if you find a good business, stick with it, because they're hard to find. They're really hard to find. So I would say the benefit is if you find a good business, stick with it, and as long as the culture's right and you've got the support of the people around you, etc., that's a big advantage, and you can grow with the business. The drawbacks are, maybe your salary doesn't accelerate quite as quickly, and if that's your motivation, then you've got to behave differently. So maybe that's part of the drawback. But I think you get, when I think about the people, who are at a senior level who I've spoken to, they always see the fact that I spent so long at AJ Bell, quite a while, a good few years at Octopus, and then certainly, almost 7 years at Praetura. They see that as a real advantage, because, as an employer or as a recruiter, you don't want to really see somebody moving all the time.
Yeah.
It doesn't look good. You start questioning, well, what's the motivation? How long are you going to be with us? All that kind of thing. So yeah, listen, it's horses for courses. It depends what you want out of it. Personally, I think 2 or 3 moves, in the right business is absolutely fine.
Suppose just to touch on that, John. You talk about AJ Bell, for example, and then Octopus, and I suppose a big benefit would be the investment that the business puts into you as well. So they've got that belief in you. Andy in the early days that allowed you to move from the admin side to 100%. The sales side and things like that. Yeah. And that's one thing that really does shine in your career, looking back from an outside perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, you need supportive, you need supportive employer, you need supportive people around you, going to give you a chance and all the rest of it. But yeah, you're right. You can move around and, you can take advantage. If those individuals know you as a person, then they'll back you, more often than not. And also, being there, if you get those chances, you want to give back as well. Again, is it right to be given those opportunities and then shut the door on somebody as soon as you've got out of it what you want? I don't, for me, no. But that's fine for some people. But yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with that, Lewis. Yeah.
It's interesting you talked about it from a hiring point of view. There will be people in our audience who've moved 2 or 3 times in a short period of time. And
Yep.
we know how long the sales cycle is with advisors. You know, actually, it can be very difficult to see both sides of the coin. You might see the highs as you come in, but you almost need to go through the lows to teach yourself that element of resilience. And I suppose as a hiring manager, that might be something that you're looking for as well. Someone who's been there and done it and actually worn the t-shirt.
100%. Yeah. So tenacity, so important. I think if you lack that, you're going to struggle in sales, you know, because you can have the best product in the world, but there are some things you'll never control, you know, and at some point, you know, your numbers will come off. So absolutely, that resilience and that tenacity to keep going, you know, that ability to, you know, turn a region around or a bad quarter, a bad half year, or a bad year around. Yeah, that very, very important. So yeah, 100%. But I think, you know, from a skills point of view, I would take hunger and tenacity over, you know, raw skill to sell every day of the week, without a shadow of a doubt. Yeah.
So after AJ Bell, left in 2014, next stop was Octopus. You were there for a good stint, but more recently you've been at Praetura for the last 7 years or so.
Yeah.
How did you find that transition initially?
So I suppose the starting point is, why did I do it? So I left, you know, I've been at AJ Bell for 16 years or whatever, and I had a great time. But it was time to do something a little bit different, you know. And I think you said, Lewis, you know, hanging on coattails. I think, you know, I think a lot of us did that to some extent at AJ Bell. You know, you've almost got to kind of trust, you know, can you actually do this outside of AJ Bell? Because you can get a little bit like, crikey, I'm AJ Bell and I'm always going to be AJ Bell. And that's fine, you know, it's a brilliant business. But I just wanted to test myself in different ways. And I had a few friends who had kind of built up just over the years of being in the industry who were at Octopus, and one of them said, oh, you must come down and meet a few people. And I wasn't really that interested, you know, I was quite happy doing what I was doing in the Northwest with AJ Bell, but eventually he convinced me to come down. It was almost like a bit, not a favour, but it was like, yeah, okay, just get him off my back, I'll go down. And I met some people at Octopus, and, you know, again, you know, I'm fortunate. I've met some really truly inspirational people. You know, I would consider Andy one of those, definitely. But I met Simon and a guy called Neil Buckland, who was head of sales at Octopus, and just what they were looking to do, and it was mind blowing. And I kind of came out, I was like, crikey, I was not expecting that. You know, that gave me a real dilemma, because I really did enjoy it at AJ Bell, but it just tied in with the fact I've been there a long time. So anyway, so I left and joined Octopus. That transition, there was quite a bit of expectation from Octopus' point of view, because I've been reasonably successful at AJ Bell, you know, and I think part of that, you know, is down to me and part of it down to AJ Bell. You know, it's good business and very well respected. So there's quite a lot of expectation, but it's only when you get into that space do you realise this is worlds apart. This is so different. So I'd built up a really, really good black book of advisors who I still speak to this day, whom, you know, just supported me through thick and thin at AJ Bell, and to some extent made it probably easier than it probably should have been. You know, that's what you're trying to get to, isn't it? You know, and then I go into Octopus, understanding it's a very different space, but I don't think you ever truly understand. I thought, okay, got my black book, get my black book out, here we go. You know, Jon Prescott's going to absolutely smash this to bits. And it didn't happen immediately, you know, and so some of those firms where I had amazing relationships, they just didn't operate in that space, you know. So this is kind of 10 years ago now, 10 and a half years ago. And, you know, the tax efficient space has moved on massively, but 10 and a half years ago, you know, it's still not mainstream now, but it's becoming more mainstream. But 10 and a half years ago, yeah, you know, the number of advisors that were operating in that space was nothing like what it is today. So I didn't really get that big immediate kick. But anyway, go back to basics, activity, you know, activity. And that's what I did. And, you know, within 12 months, I was doing a pretty decent job. But the step is quite big. So, you know, whenever I recruit now, I always make that really clear, because it's important they don't, one, panic when they do come in. If you know you've got the right person, you don't want them panicking, you know, because they panic and they go. You don't want that. But conversely, before they do come, they need to understand this is not a direct correlation to where you've come from. In fact, quite the opposite. It's a very, very different space. So I'm glad I made it. I think it's a really fascinating space, the space I work in now. But yeah, probably naively thought it was something similar, and it wasn't.
Yeah. And in terms of complexity, for two lads that have sold platform, MPS and a bit of tech around the sides, and perhaps our viewers that aren't in the tax efficient space, tell us more about that. What was the jump from selling a platform, which does have its complexities and technical elements, but to a tax efficient space that's really technical and is constantly evolving with government changes and bits like that.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more.
Okay, so I've sold platform as well, and obviously some pensions knowledge, a little bit of investments knowledge. The big fundamental difference at a high level is the fact that you're going from big picture. Fundamentally, in the platform space, in my experience, you were talking about price and a bit of technology. Yeah. You're going from that to really trying to first and foremost find advisors that don't understand that space. So a big part of your role now is education. Most advisors understand the pension, understand how platforms work. I'm then moving into a space whereby that's not the case. You're educating them on, BR, VCT, EIS, all these other nice things, how they work and all the rest of it, risk, all that kind of stuff, which was alien really to me, prior to joining Octopus. I think then additionally on top of that, you don't contract in the same way with advisors. So, in the platform space, you may say, right, okay, I'm trying to think if I've ever had this conversation, possibly, I can't recall, but okay, if you give us 50 million, move it from co-funds, Ed Carey's old place, we used to battle with Ed, move 50 million or 100 million, we'll do it at 18 basis points or whatever. That's a very different conversation to the one you're having at Octopus, which is you go and see an advisor, and it's very much case by case. And most of it, I think wrongly at the time, and it is changing, but most of it was tax led as well. I think, 10 years ago, everybody was just talking about tax and the tax benefits. Actually, the opportunity was to talk about tax benefits and the investment opportunity. And I think the market is changing now. But it was very much case by case. So tell me about Mrs. Miggins, and all that. She needed really to get into granular details. So it was a very, very different way of doing business. It wasn't big picture, walk away and come back in 2 months or whatever. It was very, very different. And dare I say, from a pure sales point of view, I would argue I probably learned more in 4.5 years at Octopus than I did in 16 at AJ Bell. And that's not decrying AJ Bell, but it's a different type of sell.
It's a sales process.
There's a real sales process. You understand, the need for activity and pipeline generation and conversion and closing and all the rest of it. It's very, very different. Big shock, big step, big difference. And I would argue some of the best people best BDMs I've worked with have been in the tax efficient space. I've worked with some really great BDMs, yeah.
Yeah, we see that all the time. I think that we want people to see the tax efficient space for what it is, which is a great opportunity and an ever expanding opportunity. You've already touched on that. The amount of demand that we hear from our advisors, can you make a recommendation to this provider or this provider? And what's really interesting is from an outside looking in, it can feel a little bit exposed to the circumstances, the government, those kind of things. We did some stuff with another provider just after the budget.
Yep.
And the panic on the advisor's faces looking at this representative saying, tell me what to do next, because they don't know. They're trusting you guys. Yep. You guys are the experts. How do you ensure that your team stay on top of that? How do you make them at the absolute pinnacle of that kind of advice and the risks?
Yeah. So the first thing I say is, you could see the budget as a negative. It's a massive opportunity. It's a massive opportunity for advisors, and by definition, it means it's a massive opportunity for BDMs working in any space. Because the one thing budgets get, particularly when there's significant change, is it creates opportunities to have conversations, and that's fundamentally all we're trying to get. And if you're a reasonable salesperson, you'll find a way of finding your way into kind of whatever they're doing. So I think the first thing to say is, budget changes and all the rest of it creates opportunity. This last budget in particular, particularly around, conversations around the removal of BR, etc. Yeah, did that create an environment where you're thinking, okay, what does it look like after the budget? Of course it did. And that's why, businesses in the tax efficient space, the way they try and mitigate that risk is by kind of offering non-tax products as well. And it's, that's strategically probably the right thing to do. From a point of view, how do you keep your BDMs, I think motivated is one question. Most of them have been around long enough to understand you never get such a big change where there's nothing, there's no work, there's no opportunities. That's the first thing. But then secondly, from a point of view, how do you keep on top of it? It's constant, mentoring, training, etc. like in anything. So, so there've been some quite material changes that are being proposed from the budget, and it's going to affect not just the tax efficient space, it's going to affect advisors with pensions and all the rest of it. And yeah, you're keeping on top of that with your BDMs, and and bear in mind, a lot of these BDMs are very, very experienced. So they're actually kind of creating the ideas for you to some extent, which is what you want. But you're just ensuring that they're on top of the detail. We'll use some external sources as well, some tax advisors, etc. So yeah, it's just about keeping on top of the detail, really. But change is a good thing. Change is a great thing. It creates opportunity for all of us. It just so happens the tax efficient space at the moment is probably getting quite a lot of headlines because of BR and this now 1 million target, etc. So yeah.
We know that, during your time as BDM and area sales director at Octopus, that regions are always huge, especially Northern England. I've got a patch right up to Inverness. Wow. When you're talking there about how you approach the conversation with advisors, does that differ, especially in sort of diverse regions? You go to Northern Ireland, for example, or up in Scotland where things might be slightly different. Does that conversation stay the same?
The conversations are the same, but I think the expectation of what's possible is different. So if you're in London, without getting too product specific, London by very nature, much more or much larger number of high earners, so, the venture capital trusts becoming more and more popular. So you're expecting to probably have more conversations around venture capital trusts in London than you are probably in the Highlands in Scotland for obvious reasons. But no, the conversations are the same, from a technical point of view, the conversations are the same. We've got regional BDMs on the ground who have operated in those regions for a long, long time. You've got to trust them. And I trust them because I've worked with most of them before already. But yeah, you trust them to kind of fill in the blanks, what kind of conversations do you need to have? But the conversations are the same. They're no different. I suppose the expectation of what's possible from a flow point of view, and, you spend more time talking about estate planning in that region than you do in another region. And that's really led by the BDMs. Yeah.
So you went from area sales as the BDM, then into senior leadership. What skills do you think it took for you to get into that, and how did you find that transition? What advice would you give to our audience who may be thinking that's the next logical step for them?
From BDM to
sales director?
Good question. So the first thing to say is I was a BDM at Octopus, and I was approached to go into management. I never sat there at any point. I was sat there in my car traveling the 40,000 miles a year or whatever I used to drive, thinking, I think sales management's for me. I didn't do that. But I was approached, and I think, for me, what I've probably been always, I wouldn't say I'm good at anything, but what I've always been keen to do is understand people. So I think if you're inquisitive with people, then, by definition, you're probably partway there to managing people, because fundamentally that's what it is. It's a role of managing people, obviously getting, driving sales and all the rest of it. But, the role of the lead, manager, sales leader, or whatever you want to call them, is about maintaining relationships with your team, managing the team, keeping them motivated, etc. So skills wise, I think, people skills are the obvious one. I think, from my point of view, I probably, and I don't want this to sound arrogant because it's not supposed to, when I think back, I was probably a little bit more strategic than a lot of other BDMs. I wouldn't just throw myself anywhere. I did that in the early days when I started kind of learning, actually, you need to be efficient, where you're going to put yourself, how you're going to do it, how you're going to plan, etc. So I think, so those kind of skills. But I think it's not for everybody. It's definitely not for everybody. It found me rather than me finding it. I'm glad it did, because I do enjoy it. I love seeing the team, the team develop, particularly the younger members of the team. So we've got 4 graduates at Praetura, really good, young men, and it's great seeing them develop. So I think you definitely need to have a attitude where you're not thinking about yourself. You need, because really the sum of the parts is what's going to drive how successful you are. So, I think if you are, completely, focused on yourself and what you do, sales management, sales leadership's not for you, leadership's not for you. But I think if, you take a lot of pleasure out of seeing other people kind of perform, and at times you could have tough conversations as well. So I don't think you can shy away from that. But I think they're the skills. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not just activity, it's kind of that effectiveness piece that's really interesting, and that kind of really interesting. You talk about being effective with your time and being strategic with your time, because everybody does a lot of traveling in this job, and I think that for it to be successful, I've often equated it to being like a diet, that if you go too heavy too quickly, then by the next month you've given up and you're just knackered and you can't be bothered with it. Whereas if you are really effective, really strategic with your time, then it can be sustainable, and that can kind of give you the longevity aspect to it.
100%. Yeah, you definitely have to be, because it does take it out of you. There's no two ways about it. You have to be efficient. If you're going to be successful, you need to be efficient. You need to understand how to move the needle. Don't throw everything at it. How do you move the needle with different accounts? The most proficient, effective BDMs I've ever worked with, and still work with to this day, they just don't sweat the small stuff. They don't concentrate on the small stuff. They're concentrating on the things that they've got in front of them. We've all come across BDMs who spend more time talking about what they don't have rather than what they do have. And you're wasting your time in the nicest possible sense. You don't have it, you can't talk about it, so concentrate on what you do have to sell. But yeah, so, using your time effectively, spending time with the people, firms, whatever, that can move the needle, but above and beyond all of that activity, yeah, you can be the best salesperson in the world, but unless you're active, you're not going to be very successful.
And no doubt you've seen some real success in the team that you've built at Praetura and, at your previous companies as well. Yeah. What can people do? What can our viewers do to stand out? You mentioned bits like tenacity and personality are bigger factors than perhaps sales skill. But what can our viewers do to really stand out and make a mark in an interview, for example?
In an interview?
Or just, they see you on the street, John, and you think he's a top bloke. That's how I am.
Yeah, so I think, so I would, this is only my experience, and I'm sure you'll get other people, who you'll have chats with, and they'll suggest something different. But I do genuinely believe, you have a room of BDMs, some really highly skilled, there are some really highly skilled sales BDMs out there, but if they don't have that tenacity and appetite and hunger, and the person next to them, they've got some good skills, they know how to sell, but they're not as probably eloquent or whatever as I would take them every day of the week. I mean, genuinely, it wouldn't even be a comparison. And I've interviewed people like this, they've got everything you could ever want. I've done this sales training, that sales training. But then you say, you ask the odd questions around, okay, well, what does your typical week look like? And it's, well, I get up and take the dog for a walk. And these are all nice things to do, by the way. There's nothing wrong with these things. Do all of that kind of stuff. But you kind of get through to the crux of it, which is they don't really have that hunger and appetite that's going to keep them driving forward. And that tenacity as well. Again, you get that from the CV. Move 10 times. Well, okay, fine, but why? What's the reason? And you can very, very, very quickly learn that of all the sales skills in the world, but unless you've got that tenacity and that belief you can kind of achieve, etc., you're going to struggle. The other things I look for that makes people stand out. So I think once you're in the business, doing all the things you'd expect, being busy, being active, making yourself available, offering support to other, business development managers, particularly if you're experienced.
The best ability is availability.
Yeah,
I've heard.
Yeah, exactly. And do you know what? Humility is a wonderful thing. An amazing thing to have. It's a great trait to have. So, being humble. Even the most successful, BDMs, where as successful as they are, they've always got time for people. They've always got time to learn. We have a guy working at Praetura. He's absolutely fantastic, very, very experienced, but he'd be the first person to ask questions. Not embarrassed to do that. So, yeah, I don't think there's like a perfect. What does a perfect BDM look like? But yeah, that humility, that appetite, that hunger. and just good people to work with, underestimated, because we probably all work with a few clowns in our time. And they're quite dangerous having a business as well.
Makes total sense. I mean, not just necessarily about BDMs, but thinking about Praetura as a whole, or just to see your employment history as a whole. Do people need to have a financial services background for you? Do you think that that's something you can teach? Is that something that you think is essential? Where does that sit?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, actually. So what I would say is, so the 4 graduates we've taken, they're really good guys. They don't have a financial services background by definition, but we took them based on what we believe to be raw skills. Okay. I think when you're if you want to become a BDM, you don't have to have a financial services background. It clearly makes it easier. But what you do need to do, and I've been quite kind of, I've made a lot of comments about this. So I would say, some of the criticisms of individuals who work in the tax efficient space is their entire knowledge of financial services is all based around tax efficient investments. They're almost product people, and in the nice possible sense, the market is professionalized so much now, you need to have much broader knowledge than that. So I would say, no, you don't have to come from financial services. Do you have to therefore have an ability to learn? Of course you do. You've got to have the capacity to learn, but I think it's got to be way beyond what you do on a day-to-day basis. The 4 graduates that we've taken, part of what they're doing is obviously understanding our products, how they interact with, in estate planning, etc. But they need to understand much, much wider than that, to be able to have really meaningful conversations with advisors. That for me is the absolute skill for the BDMs. But yeah, I think I don't think you have to come from FS, but it definitely helps. There's a lot to learn in FS. I'm 51 and I probably know 10% of what I probably should know or need to know.
I remember leaving AJ Bell at the time and thinking, this is the point about humility. Bearing in mind I was much younger and much more naive. I remember thinking, I must know pretty much everything now. I've been in the platform space, I speak to advisors all the time.
Expert.
I must be an expert. And then taking a slight pivot, not even as as extreme of a difference to kind of the tax efficient space, and thinking, shit, I know nothing here. I know 10% of what I should know. And that ability to then dive it in, and kind of take it with take the bull by the horns. I think that was like a really big learning curve for me, and it kind of makes sense when you say, you're still learning all the time.
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. Everybody, we're all still learning all the time. As long as you accept that, absolutely fantastic. But yeah, having that broad knowledge is very, very advantageous. Very advantageous. To be able to have meaningful conversations with advisors, as an example, on things that actually don't impact your day job. Well, that means by definition you're not a salesperson, you're a consultant at that point. So it's much more valuable. So yeah, you can definitely come out of a sector which is not FS and build a career. No two ways about it. I'm trying to think of examples of where I've seen that happen. I haven't, to be fair, but they will be out there. However, much easier if you've got some kind of FS background. Yeah.
Jon, so we've talked how to get a job as a BDM or a sales professional. We've talked about your experience as BDM. We've talked about how you go from BDM to a head of sales, leading a team, but you're a partner at Praetura as well. So let's touch on that and how perhaps you would manage the strategic oversight of a business like Praetura in your experience, but also still manage your team and grow their ambitions as well.
Yeah, so I'm one of the partners at Praetura, and I'm responsible for fundraising fundamentally, which means I agree sales strategy and we agree the numbers as a group of partners, and it's my job then really to share those numbers with the team and make sure the team are kind of performing to deliver on those numbers. So yeah, there's a little bit of a conflict there. Because on one hand, I'm thinking P&L, growth of the business, all the rest of it. And, in the nice possible sense, very rarely do you find a BDM who's thinking P&L, growth of the business. He's thinking, or she's thinking typically, what are my numbers? How do I earn my bonus? And what is it going to be in 4 weeks' time? So there is a bit of a conflict there, but I've always taken the view, which is if you recruit well, and like I said earlier, I'm fortunate in that most of my team, in fact, all of my team bar one, I've worked with historically, because I think, and don't get me wrong, in recruitment, you don't always get it right, and I've got it wrong a few times. But I think if you work with people before, fundamentally, you know what you're getting to start with, but I think, if you've got a team that you already know, etc., and they're experienced and they're professional, then they understand from my point of view, I've got a job to do just like they have. They understand, there's an element of trust there. They understand that, and then again, this comes through how you work with your team, etc. They know I'm fully supportive of everything they're doing, but they also understand, or I'd like to think they understand, maybe that's a different podcast, but I'd like to think they understand that they're there to perform a job, just like all of us, and I'll do everything in my power to make that role of theirs as straightforward as I possibly can be and remove those barriers. But fundamentally, they're there to drive a certain outcome for the wider business. So there are some conflicts there, but I don't. They're not conflicts that you can't manage.
Yeah.
Not by any stretch.
It's a bit of a bonus question, really, but I hadn't really planned for it. But there's this idea of the remuneration package for sales professionals being either a combination of a base salary or a bonus. How do you get that sliding scale right? And again, coming at this from what may motivate you versus, what motivates what will naturally be a diverse group of thinkers, and they'll all have a different view on that. How do you get that right from a strategic point of view?
Yeah. So it's hard. It's very, very difficult to kind of get that kind of absolutely nailed down because, without going into too much detail, the BDM always thinks they're worth more, and maybe they are. Sales has typically been, very much bonus driven, but obviously there's pressure now from the FCA not wanting everything to be bonus driven because it creates the wrong behaviours. So there's a bit of a challenge from that point of view. I think what you've got to do, the market to some extent will dictate what an experienced business development manager would be worth, and also, who are you trying to recruit? To recruit those individuals, what is it going to cost? So it's not an easy thing to do. It's not a perfect science. I think, just as a business, you've got to be comfortable if you're paying X, and your expectation of them is Y. Does that make commercial sense? And that's for the business to decide. So I don't, it's not a perfect science. It's not an easy thing to answer. In the very early days, you'd have seen very, very small salaries and very significant bonuses. And I think there's been a shift, certainly in my experience, more towards salary rather than bonus, and that's probably happened over the last 10 years. And I think part of that driven by FCA.
Yeah. You spoke earlier a little bit about the influence that your parents had and that kind of hard work that they instilled in you. And you then moved on to talk about the influence that Andy had on you in the early stages. We see mentorship coming up all the time as a talking point, and people have very different views on it. People have a very structured approach to mentorship. People have a very unstructured at the other side of that. Who influenced you other than the people that we've spoken about, and what's your view on mentorship going forward?
Yeah, so other than the people I've probably mentioned, so I think you can, I've come across hundreds of people whilst I've been working, and I think some people, they would never ever consider themselves a mentor. You wouldn't describe them as a mentor, but you'd watch them every day or listen to them and really pick up lots of things where you go, I'd love to take some of that into my life for the next 30, 40, 50
Mike
years.
Parker for us.
Yeah, Mike, exactly. Yeah, so I know Mike. Mike's a fantastic guy. And does things the right way and all the rest of it. And that was, that was very much an AJ Bell thing. You always did things the right way. And I think there's a common thread of people coming out of AJ Bell. I've got 2 ex-AJ Bell people working at Praetura. You can just tell. There is something about them. You can tell they have come from AJ Bell. It's about doing it the right way. It's not about cutting corners. It's about outcomes for the advisor and the client and so forth. So I've had lots of people where I wouldn't necessarily describe them as mentors, but I would, I'd listen, and even people you wouldn't expect. Your mentors can come from every single place, from people who are maybe high, senior execs or whatever, to individuals who have maybe just even come into the business. It doesn't really matter. One individual, in fact, two individuals do spring to mind. I've not mentioned those. So I worked under a guy at AJ Bell called Ian Bell, so it was no relation to Andy. And Ian, for anybody who knows me fairly well, they've heard this story before, so apologies, but Ian was ex-army captain, an amazing brain, but he was one hard bastard. But I loved him to bits. He was brilliant. So he really was a proper mentor. And he every month, and this is the truth, every month, and you wouldn't get away with it, and nor should you get away with it now. But every month he'd take me into a room and he would talk for 1 hour, 55 minutes and tell me how poor I was. Genuinely. And I'd be like, my eyes would be spinning around like, holy, what am I doing here? This is absolutely dreadful. But then for the next 5 minutes, and it was 5 minutes, he would just elevate me to a position where I thought I could walk on water. It was a most remarkable thing when I think back. And he did that for about 18 months, I think, something like that. Anyway, he was phenomenal. I wouldn't recommend anybody having that type of mentor. I must be probably some kind of sicko or something, but he was fantastic. And I think he was probably a bit Marmite for a lot of people. But I really, really liked him. He really believed in me. He really did believe in me. So he was really, really good. And then, the guy at Octopus, a guy called Neil Buckland, who's retired now. I said Neil was head of sales. So I think you've had Elliot G on here previously.
Yeah, I met Neil. He went over to Fidelius.
Correct.
Yeah.
He did, exactly. And Steve Skelding followed him.
Yep.
So it was Steve who was the guy who introduced me to Octopus. So it's all a very small world. But so Neil was amazing as well. And these people, as mentors, they weren't necessarily telling you how to do things. They were just, and I try and do this with, with my team or, anybody I kind of spend time with, just the benefit of what they've done, how they've done it, and then just having a bit of belief. Belief is an amazing thing. If you've got people around you believe in you, it's very, very powerful. So, so I'd say, those two individuals in particular, if you were to ask me, Andy, because Andy's Andy in the nicest possible sense, he's a good footballer as well, by the way. But anyway, but Andy, just because that was my first proper job, really, and he gave me a chance, which I'll be forever grateful for. But Ian Bell and Neil Buckland, two really impressive guys, and you just felt that they were spending time with you because they wanted you to be successful, and they saw something in you. Even if you didn't recognise it yourself, they spotted something where they went, this person's got something.
That's great. And it feeds into what you said earlier where, a mentor can be anyone. Yeah. And it feeds into that humility point that you said where keep your eyes open because you don't know who you're going to learn something from. So even if they're not would class themselves as a mentor, you can be learning from everyone.
100%. Yeah, I think the reference to 4 graduates that have arrived. I think I learn from them. I'll just be sat there listening to them, and you'll hear something. You go, okay. It doesn't have to be of technical nature. Maybe just the way they conduct themselves or whatever it is. So I don't think your mentor is necessarily somebody who you report into or is sat at the top table or whatever it is. I think your mentor, they can come from anywhere. Yeah. Your parents, your friends, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's just people who maybe you've got some kind of connection with, where they see something where they want to invest some time in you, and if you can find that, it doesn't matter who you are. Take advantage of it.
You can also you mentioned about your first role in financial services being in advice practice with maybe the not so top level leader. You almost can learn how not to do it as well from those bad leaders.
Yeah, no, absolutely will. Yeah, no, I mean, listen, it was straight out of university, young, naive, didn't know what to expect, and just not a good experience. A really poor leader. Really, really poor leader. And at the time, I just thought he was a bit of an arsehole. But now I go, well, actually, you're a poor leader. There's a difference. So, and that probably, dare I say it, in the very early days, probably scarred me a little bit because you're thinking, crikey, is this what it's like? Now, fortunately, I ended up at AJ Bell where culturally, it just wasn't like that. These were good northern people. Who were trying to create
up the north.
Up the north, correct. They were trying to create something amazing, and they did. they did create something amazing, and didn't mean it was easy, but you got a fair chance.
And we look at Jon Prescott now, from our point of view, you've had a phenomenal career. You mentioned a bit of luck, but you mentioned some of the mistakes that you've made. You said around hiring.
Yeah.
What other mistakes have you made, and what can we learn from that?
Oh, crikey, what mistakes have I made?
We'll get the list ready.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'd probably be here for a long time. And sometimes you make mistakes and you never find out. It's a mistake. But there will be mistakes.
Yeah.
Hiring is a very obvious one because, and I don't like to call them mistakes, so it's really unfair on the individual.
Learning curves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for whatever reason it didn't work out. But yeah, I've made lots of mistakes. I think the point is you need to work in a team and have the support around you to be able to make those mistakes without some kind of consequence.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, if you don't, you'll never push yourself. The business, in the nicest possible sense, won't go as fast as it can do. And Octopus were very good at that, to the extent they would almost, encourage you to make some mistakes, as perverse as that sounds. So yeah, I've made loads of mistakes, and I couldn't list them, but I have.
It's normal.
It's absolutely normal. It's absolutely normal, I've probably made some today. The problem isn't, though, the world we live in. I think this is really important, and it may not come up, but I think the feedback bit, we live in a world today where people don't really give feedback. They're a bit, everybody's on eggshells and all the rest of it. And I think it's the most valuable thing you can do for somebody is give them some, feedback. And, it's not criticism, it's developmental feedback or whatever. We're not very good at that. And as a consequence, sometimes you've made a mistake and you won't even be told you made a mistake and you won't even know it. So I think, it's upon everybody, particularly your manager, to be honest and, if you've got that kind of relationship and really kind of highlight they're not really, are they mistakes? Maybe judgment errors or whatever it is, or areas where you could improve. But I would say, don't be afraid of pushing yourself. Don't be afraid of taking risks. It's a lot easier though if you're in a business whereby you've got the support. A lot easier. Because if you haven't, you'll be scared stiff of making mistakes.
That sort of circle of trust and comfort and
yeah. Because some we're human beings at the end of the day. We're not robots. And we make mistakes.
You'll be pleased to know that for our audience who don't know Mike Parker, he's a teddy bear really, but he comes across a little bit grumpy. He described feedback as the breakfast of champions last week. So if you know him, you'll know that that's very un-Mike Parker.
It sounds like The Office, something out of The Office there, doesn't it?
He is getting more David Brent in his older age.
It does, So maybe it is. But, if nobody tells you, you just don't know, do you? So have I made mistakes? Absolutely. Have I been told about them? Absolutely. But I'm sure some have gone by and no one's ever said anything.
Yeah. Perfect. So just we're going to finish off with a little bit just as kind of how you see the world, but just from a kind of an initial entry point of view, if you had somebody, say, take the graduates in that position now, what advice are you giving to them when they get in there? What advice, you talk about the trust and the making people feel safe and all of those kind of bits. What advice are you giving to those guys and girls who are at the start of their career, who do see this as a long-term stay and not just kind of a job that they've fallen into?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is, you've got to set an expectation of what's required, because again, I think we kind of accept average a little bit easier. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Well, I'm going to say it anyway. I think average is almost kind of accepted now, and average is fine. But you're not going to stand out because average by definition is where most people are at. So, and I had this conversation with the team only last week, and it's not to put pressure on, but it's to say, you're four really talented individuals, have got amazing opportunities ahead of you, but you have to stand out and you have to make yourself valuable, and you've got to, make yourself differentiating yourself to other BDMs. And so when you think of, what does good look like? Good isn't average. Good is good. Set the bar really high. So that would be the first thing. The next thing I'd say is have an open mind. Have an open mind, because at the moment you work at X and we don't want you to work there forever. But, it's a bit contradictory because I say, I don't like people who move around too much. But I think really early days in your career, make sure you're at the right business. And it might not be it's the wrong business because it's not a good business. It just might not be the right business from a personality point of view or whatever. So I think make sure you get that. Build lots and lots of valuable contacts within the business. Go and ask, what else can I do? It's the thing nobody does. I'll just do the day job. But that's not going to make you stand out. Go and ask, what else can I do? How else can I add value to this business? All the rest of it. And then just work hard. Be resilient, be tenacious, work hard. It's not rocket. It's like in any role. It's not rocket science, I don't think there's anything to add, really. I think, just work hard, build a good network, do what you say you're going to do. Don't accept average. Average is fine if you want to be there, but if you want to kind of accelerate your career quite quickly, I don't think average is probably going to get you there. Except you need a bit of luck. I've had quite a bit of luck. Sure you two have as well. You need a bit of luck, and then beyond that, don't really know. Really, it's probably down to the individual. Yeah.
Well, you're certainly doing a great job, Jon. I've met a couple of the grad guys, and you've got some real talent there. So it's exciting to see where they get to.
Yeah.
Sort of finally then, pivoting slightly, what topics are you sort of seeing coming up in financial planning, and what excites you about the future of financial planning, not your future?
I was going to say I'm probably 5 years off retirement or something like that, but so no, I think, listen, financial services is an amazing industry to work in. There's huge opportunity. You can build a really lovely career for yourself. You can earn, good money if that's what you want to do. I think though, the opportunity is the fact from a financial planning point of view, because of what's gone on in the marketplace with tax and all the rest of it, planning now has become more important than ever. So I think if you're a financial planner or you're a BDM working with financial planners, the opportunity is enormous. I know we've got direct to consumer, that's really important for some individuals. But I think financial planning per se has become more valuable without a shadow of a doubt, because you've only got to look at estate planning, really complicated. Financial planners are required more than ever because that kind of cropping up all the time. So I think, that's exciting. I think the use of technology in the industry is really exciting. I think the bit where probably there's still a lot of work to do is those individuals where they've only got, relatively modest portfolios, where they can't afford advice. I think there's a lot needs to be done there. So I think that's one of the challenges. I think, challenge from a point of view of if you're an advisor, what is that challenge? For me, the biggest thing I see is how do you differentiate? It's a competitive landscape. They're operating in arguably a commoditized environment. Investments are investments. There's not a great deal you can put between one DFM and another in the nicest possible sense. So you're not going to differentiate on that way. So how you differentiate your proposition, and I think that's a challenge for the advisor community. I question, what they do or, what they're doing to try and create that kind of distance from other advisors. And I don't know the answer. I don't necessarily know the answer, but I think it's an area where if I was a financial advisor, I'd be spending a lot of my thought process thinking, okay, how do I differentiate this business? How do I differentiate my proposition? Because I think if you don't, I think it's pretty tough.
Yeah. I think it's the same in our world. Justine Randall said it, on the podcast with her. Most platforms, most portfolios, funds are all around a similar price that are trying to achieve a similar thing.
Correct.
So it's how can you differentiate yourself as a BDM as well?
100%. Yeah. I think, in your world, I think you're doing that, aren't you? Really successfully with your technology, and your cash flow modeling and all the rest of it. I think from a BDM point of view, how can you differentiate yourself? Work harder than the next guy. Make yourself available.
Have some personality. People buy from people. Build really good, strong, long-term relationships. Don't try and be an expert. Be humble, but have much broader knowledge than just your own product. Yeah,
I think you can tick those boxes. You're probably in a good place.
Definitely, and the reason we started this community in the first place was field sales can be incredibly lonely, and that there are so many good ideas that we can share just by talking to each other. If you were to leave our audience, the trusted community, with one parting gift, one parting advice, what would you tell them?
probably don't do a podcast. No. So it's a good question. I think, I think, for me, financial services is a really, really spectacular place to be. I think the opportunities are endless. I think it's not without its challenges, but I think if you put the effort in, you can build a really, really amazing career and meet amazing people. So I would say, for those BDMs who are listening, and by the way, I don't think I'm the template, just to be clear. I don't think I'm the template for anything, but I think just stick with it, because it can be tough at times, but stick with it. And yeah, I think, don't expect it all to come overnight. I think you've got to play a bit of a long game as well. If you're fortunate enough for it to happen overnight, congratulations, but I don't think that's most people's experience. Mike Parker's probably as old as me. He's about 103 now, isn't he? Something like that. So, but yeah, so I think, amazing opportunity in FS. I've certainly enjoyed my time in FS and continue to do so. That'll be my parting shot.
Well, Jon, it's been an absolute pleasure. There are so many things that we can learn just from that conversation. So just wanted to thank you for your time. And
thank you. Enjoy it.
Jon.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.